So thank you everyone for being here. And thank you for bringing some people with you, Reshanne. Our speaker this evening is Reshanne Reeder from the University of Edge Hill University, and she's going to talk to us this evening about the diversity of human imagination, which sounds really interesting. So thank you, Reshanne, over to you.
Great. So yes, I hope everybody can see my screen. I assume, yes, you can, because I did change the title since the advertisement, because I was thinking while I was making the slides, the diversity of visual imagination is kind of restrictive in terms of the types of imagination that I'm going to talk about today, because imagination is not just visual and it's not just sensory. And what I'm going to explain in my talk today, hopefully, is that some people have a very vivid visual imagination, some people have a very abstract imagination, and everything in between. And I'm going to provide some new evidence on how this affects people's subjective experience in the world. So, all right, I'll jump right in. So basically, this is some people's idea of what the spectrum of visual mental imagery or visualization ability kind of looks like. Basically, for decades, even since the cognitive revolution, philosophers and cognitive scientists have known that there are individual differences in various aspects of sensory imagination. So it's important to think about how clear is your mental picture, how vivid, but also other things like how high is the resolution or how detailed is it? Can you zoom in and out of your images, and can you rotate images? Can you change the color? If I ask you to imagine something like an apple, can you imagine a red apple as well as a green apple? Is it an outline, or is it more cartoony, or is it very realistic? So for hundreds and even thousands of years, actually, people have been discussing whether mental images are actually pictures at all, pictures in the mind that sort of simulate visual perception. Some people argue that they're simply abstract concepts, words, or feelings associated with those ideas. But it's only recently that scientists have concluded that it really depends on individual differences. Oh, and please, if you would like to just add questions into the chat, they'll obviously pop up onto my screen. So you're welcome to pop questions up as I'm talking, and I'm happy to answer your questions, and just interrupt me. If you even want to turn on your microphone, that's fine with me. It's not going to interrupt my flow, so don't worry about that. Or if you have questions at the end, yeah, you can also ask your questions at the end. So aphantasia, which is a blind mind's eye, that's the term for people whose imagination contains no visual features. So thinking of an apple, if you ask somebody with aphantasia to imagine an apple, they're going to bring to mind a concept instead of a picture. And congenital aphantasia, or lifelong aphantasia, that is not the result of brain trauma, came to scientific attention in about 2015. So it used to be thought, at least from about 2010 and onwards, that aphantasia was only an acquired phenomenon due to brain injury. But in fact, people can have it their whole lives, and it's a very natural phenomenon. Oh, how do I go on to the next slide? Okay, on the opposite end of the spectrum is hyperphantasia, which is extremely vivid mental imagery. And the term was coined in 2020, so pretty recently. And although it has been long known that people can have very vivid imagery, not much is known about this group, this hyperphantasia group, or how they differ from people with typical imagery. And I'm going to denote typical imagery with this cartoony apple, and aphantasia with a head that has basically the blind mind's eye, and hyperphantasia with the apple that is very realistic. So the way that mental imagery is currently assessed is via one metric called the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, or Vviq. And on this questionnaire, people rate the vividness of various described visual scenarios, like imagine a sunset, imagine a window display in a shop. There are 16 questions, and if you rate all of the questions as ones, that means I only thought about the concept, but I didn't have a picture. And then you get a score of 16. So 16 is the lowest score that you can get on this questionnaire. If you rate all of the questions on the Vviq as 5s, that's as vivid as actually seeing the thing in front of you, you get a score of 80. And that's considered hyperphantasia, the highest score that you can get. And although the Vviq only measures the vividness of imagery and not other aspects like control or precision or details, it is currently the most popular metric that we have. Another issue is that since about 2015, many studies have used very different score cutoffs to categorize people into different mental imagery groups. So for example, some studies have a very conservative estimate for aphantasia, and they determine that as scores on the Vviq between 16 and 23. Sometimes that's extended to 25. And in some cases, actually very often, most often, people with dim or vague imagery are included in the aphantasia category, usually to increase sample size in studies because complete aphantasia is more rare. However, this might potentially add to some noise in the data. And then also distinguishing who has typical or average imagery also has its problems. Many studies categorize typical imagery as any score above a 32, not distinguishing extremely vivid imagery from the rest of that group. Some studies suggest ambiguous or borderline weak imagery scores should be removed from analysis to try to artificially increase differences between groups. And then others categorize typical imagery as selective scores centered around some average determined after collecting the complete sample. And again, that removes a lot of the natural variation in a sample. And then finally, only within the last 2 years, hyperphantasia has been distinguished as its own category in studies of visual imagery differences. So as you can see, the classification of different imagery abilities doesn't currently have much agreement. And depending on how you categorize your sample, you can likely achieve very different results. And then I'm also very interested in this dim or vague imagery category because so far in the scientific literature, this group is largely either ignored or considered the same as aphantasia. But my collaborators and I suspected that they might actually have some fundamental differences to people with aphantasia. So because after all, they do have some imagery. So we are interested in this particular category that is usually ignored or lumped in with aphantasia. And so for the current talk, I'm going to refer to these individuals as having hypophantasia or low imagery, and I'll talk about them as a category of their own. So to reiterate, most studies of aphantasia compare people with no or low imagery to people with typical or vivid imagery. And my hypothesis is that this method might actually muddle up meaningful data by treating very different types of imagery the same. So my collaborators and I came up with an interview method to categorize people into 4 meaningful categories that we could compare to one another. So for example, we have the typical imagery category, and we're going to compare them to people with complete aphantasia. And then we have the hyperphantasia category that we'll compare to the other groups. And then the hypophantasia category. And we're going to compare hypers to hypos as well. So the goal is to determine which groups show differences from each other and whether any particular pair of groups contribute most strongly to the imagery differences that we currently find in the literature. So now I'm going to take you through some of the things that we've learned about each group from the interviews that we conducted. And after you get a profile of the different groups, I'll take you through some of the research that we've done to test for differences between groups. And I'll start with aphantasia, which is a completely blind mind's eye. And typically people with aphantasia will describe their experience as a feeling or knowing something rather than having any kind of imagery, rather than having a mental picture, that is. And we know this from the interviews. And I've just picked out some quotes that people with aphantasia have used to describe their aphantasia. So for example, they might say, I have no words, it's abstract, I can describe visual things, I know what it's like. It's completely conceptual based on logic, no color, no shape, just the concept. When I ask somebody to describe someone who's very familiar to them, they describe their husband. but they said, I know what he looks like, but I can't imagine him in my mind. There are lots of words. I get a lot of feelings surrounding something. Some people have a list of words in their mind or a list of things that they've memorized. And some people don't even have words. They just imagine things in a very abstract way. Aphantasia also often affects multiple senses. So something else that we noticed from the interviews is people saying that they have multiple types of aphantasia, not just visual aphantasia. So people will report, I have no inner voice, for example, which can be very surprising to auditory researchers who oftentimes believe that everybody has an inner voice, but probably didn't talk to people with aphantasia. Some people can recall melodies and tunes, but they don't hear them in their head. No smell or taste. I've asked people, and also this was part of the interview, was to ask people to imagine different senses. So touching ice. Can you imagine what touching ice feels like? Can you imagine hearing your favorite song in your head? And they oftentimes people with aphantasia will say, no, I can't imagine any of that. One person actually, very interestingly, said that they developed their inner voice over time, but they used to have to speak out loud or read while mouthing the words pretty quietly. And if it's totally silent, they wouldn't be able to even understand the concepts that they were reading, which is a very interesting thing that I don't think most researchers even know about. Other people said, no auditory imagery, can't bring up the way something smells or feels even. However, something very interesting is that people with aphantasia can get imagery in dreams or while drifting off to sleep. So for example, someone reported, when I'm sleeping, I definitely see stuff. Another person said, right before sleeping, I get flashes of imagery, then I'm asleep. It'll startle me. I can't focus on it. It flashes, then it's gone. Only a few times it's been really clear. It's like an explosion of images. Someone else said, I've had imagery twice during transition to sleep, some vague imagery. I once had a dream that I had a butler, and I tried to imagine that I had a butler after I woke up. But when I tried to imagine it, it was all just red and basically like the inside of their eyelids. And some people tend to think that their aphantasia might affect their memory, although it is very inconclusive to what extent aphantasia affects memory. And I am going to get into some of the research on this that I've done. But sometimes people say, for example, I might have deficient memory because I can't remember things from the past unless there's video footage or photographs. And some people know that they have what's called severely deficient autobiographical memory, which might correlate with aphantasia, but it's still not very clear what the association is. And it seems that when people with aphantasia imagine things, they have a good sense of space, but not visual features as much. So when I ask somebody to imagine their front door, a very normal, everyday sort of object that they see all the time, they said, I can sense the space. The door is holding this space. Someone else said that they have a good sense of direction, but it's like navigating with a blindfold on. Actually, other people say that they have a bad sense of direction because of their aphantasia. So there seems to be a bit of conflict there. And then somebody else said, if I imagine a busy street, I get the sense that everyone is very close to me. So they can have this sense of a very enclosed space, a more open space, something being crowded or small or large, but it's not visual, which is incredibly interesting to me, that you can have this non-visual spatial imagination. And people with aphantasia tend to find alternative strategies to perform different tasks. So for example, an artist told me other people paint from memory, whereas I have to have the original in front of me, otherwise it doesn't work. I think of beats of a song and put ideas to certain rhythms to remember things, instead of, for example, some people use rooms of a house to remember a sequence visually, but this person uses beats of a song to remember a sequence of items. So this is the profile of people with aphantasia that I've gleaned from some of the interviews that I've done, and also from some of the interviews that my colleagues have done. Hyperphantasia Well, the really interesting thing about hypophantasia, as I said before, is we're not sure whether they belong to a distinctive subgroup or if they're part of an aphantasia distribution. And something that was really interesting that might be even unique to our study is that when we started conducting the interviews, all of the people with hypophantasia initially thought that they had complete aphantasia. So when you see the studies that I report on later in this talk, the 13 people with hyperphantasia who belong to that category actually believed that they had complete aphantasia before they did an interview with me or one of my collaborators. So it is a unique subgroup, I think, because these people for the longest time believed they didn't have any imagery whatsoever. However, a few things that they said in their views led us to believe that they were a distinctive category. So I'm going to take you through. Can somebody mute their microphone, please? Or does somebody have a question? Okay. So like I said, people with hypophantasia tend to think that they have complete aphantasia. So when we started the interviews, they would say things like, I'm at the lowest end of the imagery scale. My imagery is all but non-existent. I think I can't imagine anything. If I try to imagine something, I can't see anything. It's black in front of me. I don't really have anything at all. So these people started out thinking they have no imagery whatsoever, just like somebody with aphantasia. However, as the interviews progressed, we learned that these people actually have some controlled imagery ability. So we would ask them to perform a series of imagery exercises. So again, imagine your front door. Some person reported, I actually get an image of a white color, also shape. Someone else reported, I can consciously create an image. Something as simple as an apple or a color, I might get there. When I ask people to imagine a sunset, which is a very visual type of imagery, somebody reported, I see the icon of a sun, like a cartoony icon, or a plain outline. And then I asked someone else to imagine the face of someone who's very familiar to them. They imagined their mom's face, and they said, it's kind of shapes, and there's a little bit of color. And then there was another one where I asked people to imagine navigating their house, and somebody said, it's not from a first-person perspective. It's more like I'm watching someone else through the roof. It's small, like sort of a drawing, a line on the floor. So sometimes it takes a while to get people to that point where you're like, are you sure? Are you sure? Do you have imagery or not? So we have to take them through a few different exercises, and it can get to that point where actually it seems they might have a little bit of imagery ability. They can usually activate some faint colors or shapes, usually. However, their imagery is always very effortful and weak and faint. So of course, it is easy to just classify, right, if I'm not going to put any effort into my imagery, I can't see anything. So perhaps I have aphantasia. However, what I think is the distinction is that even people with complete aphantasia, no matter how hard they try, they can't control, they can't activate their imagery voluntarily. However, someone with hyperphantasia, if they put some effort into it, they can get to that point. So, for example, someone with hyperphantasia might report, it's not perhaps defined enough. It's very simplistic. It's hard to hold on to, hard to grasp, very, very vague. I see the line of where buildings are and the sky. I don't ever think of colors when I'm imagining something. It's more like an outline. Someone else could imagine basic colors. And someone else said, I can't recall an entire event, an autobiographical event, but a snapshot of that event. So it's never at that point where they really want to be at that sort of, most people with hypophantasia feel like if they practiced or like could tap into it, they could get a clear image, but it's really frustrating for them because they're not at that point where they can actually make a clear visual image of something. Also, their imagery is usually something they have seen before. That tends to be the easiest type of imagery to activate. That's why we ask them to imagine very familiar things to them, like the face of a familiar family member or their front door. So they report things like, generally, I get that if it's something that I've seen recently, When I imagine things, it's based off of things I've already experienced. If I've experienced it, then I've got more of a visual than if I actually just haven't experienced it. And someone else said, sometimes photos I can bring to mind. Their imagery is, however, often uncontrolled. So they typically report things like, I can't control myself to do it when I want. I don't know how to bring it up. Being in a trance or meditating, I might get clear things, super, super clear. Fractal geometric shapes or morphing faces, but in a normal waking state, closing the eyes, next to nothing. Someone else said, I do sometimes, when I'm not trying, get an image. Also, people with hypophantasia often report emotional imagery. So they say things like, it's imagery I can feel. I can feel it more than I can actually visualize. It's more like a feeling. I can't really describe it. I think how I would feel. I can imagine what someone said, how I felt. This is actually also somewhat typical of people with aphantasia. They tend to imagine things as sort of a feeling, but I would think just sort of subjectively that it's more emotional in the hypophantasia group and more conceptual in the aphantasia group. So there is the sort of categorization of people with hypophantasia compared to aphantasia. I think they are a distinctive subgroup, but there has to be more research on this to really get that idea. Next, we move on to the typical imagery category. They are definitely the easiest to categorize because they are the most common, and they also have the shortest interviews for all of those reasons. They're the easiest to categorize. They think their imagery is nothing really special. So it usually takes just maybe 2 to 3 minutes to categorize someone with typical imagery to get to that categorization. So people with typical imagery tend to have very clear mental images, and it's easy. However, the images are often limited in vividness. So for example, if I ask somebody with typical imagery to imagine a sunset, they say, I put my sunset over the ocean. It's kind of yellow, close to the horizon. It turns orange, red, purple, then the whole sky is purple, not too intense. I put it over the ocean. There's quite a clear sky. It's orangey red, reflecting, clear, nothing else apart from the sun, like looking at a photograph. No beach, no clouds, just the sun. If someone asked me to imagine a purple iguana eating a papaya, I can do that, only with a black background, no details. So even people with typical imagery can make up images sometimes, like fantastical images a little bit, like a purple iguana, but it's not going to be extremely detailed, usually. However, typical imagery can be very vivid in specific situations. Another reason why someone with typical imagery is usually easy to classify is that they have something very vivid to compare it to. So sometimes, for example, one person reported to me the other day, I was looking at the sky and imagining a big glowing bioluminescent manta ray swimming through the sky. But I might have been high when that happened. And then another person I was talking to actually was a competitive football player. And he said, I play football, so I imagine things like the goal and how I'm going to get there very vividly, like a 9 out of 10. But otherwise, I'd say my imagery is like a 6 out of 10. So in certain situations, people with typical imagery can have very vivid imagery, but not usually. They don't tend to daydream. That is one of the, I would say, particular hallmarks of typical imagery is that their imagery doesn't tend to interfere with their daily life. They don't tend to daydream. So someone said, sometimes I daydream, not normally unprompted. I used to, not as much anymore. I did a lot more as a kid, but I stopped so I could focus on school. Actually, that's something that we've heard a lot from people, is that they remember a time when their imagery was actually a lot more vivid, usually when they were a kid and they daydreamed a lot, or they came up with stories or imaginative scenarios or situations. But as they got older, their imagery kind of dimmed because they were focusing on their job or on school, and they realized they couldn't be daydreaming anymore. that tends to happen a lot with people who are adults with typical imagery. So this is kind of the profile of someone with typical imagery, which tends to belong to most people. And then we get on to hyperphantasia, which is extremely vivid imagery. And when we started interviewing people, again, we weren't sure how many people we were going to get who have hyperphantasia. And in fact, as we were doing interviews, as I was doing interviews with my collaborator at Edge Hill University, we found that there were quite a lot of people who actually have hyperphantasia. And in fact, it might be more prevalent than what scientists believe currently. And one reason for that might be because people with hyperphantasia tend to think their imagery is relatively average. But when we, again, start probing them and asking them more questions about their imagery during the interviews, it actually comes out that their imagery is quite different from average, which I'll explain in just a few moments. So the way that people with hyperphantasia tend to describe their imagery is pretty average, reasonably good, but somewhere in the middle, sort of in the middle, above average, but not the most vivid, probably medium, not that vivid, good imagination, but somewhere in the middle, probably in the middle. So they do, I would say, I don't have statistics on this, but I would say probably about 85% of them or so tend to think that their imagery is pretty average. And I think the reason for that is because people just don't tend to compare their imagery to other people. So if you have an extreme form of imagery, aphantasia or hyperphantasia, people don't tend to realize that they're any different from anybody else. Yeah, oh, here we go. What sort of percent did you find with hyperphantasia overall? In the Edge Hill interviews, that is at my university, we got about, we got like 64 interviews and about 15 people with hyperphantasia. So quite a lot of them actually qualified as having hyperphantasia. Right, but the thing that makes people with hyperphantasia different from the typical imagery spectrum is that they tend to have very realistic imagery. So I asked them, how realistic is your imagery? Very realistic. It's lifelike. I can almost feel like I'm there. It's like I'm actually there, like the person is in front of me. One person who I was interviewing, I asked her to imagine again, the face of a very familiar family member, and she decided to imagine her son. And she said that her son was standing right in front of her from her imagination. And she said he was moving around, he was smiling, he was laughing. So it was really interesting that she could see all of these details of her son right in front of her. And it was just the easiest thing in the world for her. Is the age group relevant in the prevalence of hyperphantasia? I don't think so. I actually don't think so. I didn't do any age analyses, but we do have a good age range of people with hyperphantasia. So in the group from Edge Hill University, they're mostly students, so 18 to like 21 years. However, I did interview personally quite a few people with hyperphantasia who were older. So a woman in her 50s. And then online, when I was doing the interviews, so we did the interviews in two different places. We either did them on campus at the university, or we recruited people through our websites and YouTube. And when we recruited people, they tended to be older, out of university. And a lot of the people with hyperphantasia were middle-aged. So there doesn't seem to be yeah, it's hard to know exactly though the prevalence in terms of age, and hard to get like a good sample of different ages, but I don't think it matters. I think that hyperphantasia as well as aphantasia tend to be lifelong. So if you are born with this extremely realistic imagery, you're probably going to keep it. You mentioned that kids have more vivid imagery. Yes, well, that's a lot of people with typical imagery as adults tend to say that their imagery was more vivid as kids. But I mean, there's no way to know if it was hyperphantasia or just vivid typical imagery. Kids tend to daydream. So I don't know if that makes it particularly hyperphantasia for kids. Maybe kids need a different sort of classification system, actually, but we didn't test any kids. We just tested adults who said, when I was a kid, I had more vivid imagery. So it is really difficult to tell. So all of the people that we classified in the current study, all 126 people, were adults. They were over the, and I think the oldest, somebody in their 60s, maybe even 70s, but perhaps Alec could, Alec is here, my citizen science collaborator. He could potentially add into the chat if he knows the ages of anybody. There he is. That's Alec. I'll introduce him just a little bit later for one of the studies. Right. So another cornerstone of hyperphantasia that is really interesting is that people with hyperphantasia report that they can project images into the real world. So for example, we ask them, can you see something right in front of you right now? Can you imagine a painting on the wall? Can you imagine an animal running across, like a little hamster or something running across your keyboard right now? Something fantastical or something kind of normal? Can you just imagine? People with hyperphantasia tend to say, yeah, I watch characters. I actually, I interviewed someone who does creative writing, and she said, I watch my characters that I'm writing. I watch them interact with each other, walking around, and then I write down what they do. So she was saying it's so easy for her to write stories because it's like it's not even her imagination. She's not even trying. It's like the characters have a mind of their own. Someone else said, yes, I can see my son next to me smiling and laughing. That was the one that I talked about previously. Someone else works with kids, and they do like activities, sort of physical activities with kids. And they said, yes, I can project like activity stations for the kids that I work with, and I know it's going to work or not. Someone else said, I can imagine pictures on the wall, and I can put things together very easily. Is this like a hallucination that a person conjures up? I don't think that it's like a hallucination, actually, because people are very aware that it's not real. So even though it's very lifelike and they're like, yeah, I can imagine this right there, they're not like freaking themselves out like that thing is actually there. So, you know, it's expected. They can control it usually. And it's something that is not, I wouldn't call it a hallucination because they know it's not real. Where do I fall in this spectrum? I used to think that I have hyperphantasia, but when I started interviewing people with hyperphantasia, I thought, actually, I think my imagery is pretty typical. I'm one of those who, when I was a kid, I used to have more vivid imagery, definitely, but it is not at that level anymore. And I can't project like that. Is there any link to autism? That's a really good question. It's not something that I investigated for the current study. But it is something that has been investigated. I do think that both hyperphantasia and aphantasia are linked to autism. And I think the reason for that is because anybody at these extreme ends are probably more likely to have neurodivergences of different kinds. So I think that they're probably more likely to have autism. They're probably more likely to have different sorts of neurodivergences, not just autism. So other things like perceptual disorders as well. But yeah, good question, very good question. Something that a lot of people are investigating. Probably going to keep hyperphantasia. I'm 52. I jolly well hope I'm going to keep it. Yeah, it's like time travel, but fascinating to hear that not everyone has such delight and joy. Yes, that's another thing, is that people are very entertained with their hyperphantasia. It is definitely a very fun experience for those people. That's another cornerstone that I think might even be the next one that I'm going to talk about. If I'm drunk, I lose my visual imagery, makes me panicky. Oh dear. Do you tend to have quite low imagery, faint sort of effortful imagery, or what is your imagery, Nicola? Not very, oh no, very high. Very high. Oh wow. I've never heard of that. That's really interesting. Huh. I would think that usually when people are drunk that their imagery is more vivid because, you know, lower inhibitions and everything, but I guess not. Ah, okay, okay. I didn't make that connection. All right. So yes, typically people with hyperphantasia have strong emotions tied to their imagery. Before I go on to that though, taking notes. Yep, take notes so that we can keep investigating this. It's really interesting because people are so different. We try and find these commonalities, but of course it's not the same for everybody. Is there any correlation between these categories and a tendency to have dreams? It doesn't seem that way. A lot of people with aphantasia tend to report that they have dreams, as I mentioned earlier on. Some of them say they don't have dreams. Actually, what I think is that everybody has dreams, they just don't remember them. So I would think especially people who have poor visual imagination, so aphantasia or hypophantasia, they probably dream visually. It's hard for them to remember because when they wake up, they don't have that visual imagery anymore, so they can't remember it. So I think there's a recall problem there, but I don't know how to test it. It would be really interesting to do a sleep study, I suppose. Okay, yeah, sorry, let's go on. So people with hyperphantasia tend to have strong emotions tied to their imagery. So they've said things like, when I ask them, do you ever have emotions tied to your imagery? They say, sometimes scary imagery hinders me from being able to go somewhere because I freak myself out. And this tends to be something that is very common with hyperphantasia, is they are able to freak themselves out, disgust themselves with like really gross imagery or like disturbing imagery. They can usually change their mood with their imagination. It can change them for a long time. So also in their dreams, if they have a very disturbing dream, it can affect them throughout the day. Other people say, I feel like my visualization is heightened for disturbing stuff. If something is gory, I see it forever. It doesn't leave my brain. So there is a little bit of a lack of control there. They usually can control it very well. So like if I ask them, do you freak yourself out with scary movies? A lot of people with hyperphantasia actually say, actually, I don't like scary movies because why would I do that to myself? Because I know it's just going to freak me out for the rest of the day. So usually they find ways. They also find strategies to sort of stop themselves from getting those images. They can also easily imagine unreal things. So I have a lot here. One person said, I don't daydream about winning the lottery, things like that. My daydreams tend to be away with the fairies. Another person said, I like walking a lot because I like to imagine walking in a fantasy world. When I'm reading, I don't see the words on the page, and it's just like watching a new film in my head. Someone else said, yes, I like to imagine sci-fi and fantasy realms. When I'm looking at something, I can imagine different layers popping out. So one person said, if they look at their hand, they can see like the skin and the bones and the muscles all pulled away from their hand, and they can rotate it and observe it from all these different angles. And she was one of those people who said, oh, but my imagery is nothing special. So that's the profile of somebody with hyperphantasia. So we have these 4 different imagery profiles that we're going to investigate with these objective tests and also some questionnaires. So the interviews that we took on the Edge Hill University campus, those are not tied to the data that I'm going to show you now. It's the online interviews that we took that I'm going to show you the data for. We did this very huge test battery where we asked people to do the interview first. We classified them as having one of the 4 categories, and then we had them do this big test battery of different memory abilities, being able to project, Ganz flicker, which is this pseudo hallucination stuff, which I'm going to talk about all of it. So I'm just priming you that it was 64 people that we interviewed on the university campus, and they contributed to these profiles. But the data that I'm going to show you is based on 60 individuals, or 60, can't remember now, 64 individuals from the online interviews. To go to sleep, I like to imagine a room and view it from the different corners. Quite dull, but generally works better than thinking of sheep. Yeah, sheep can be kind of boring if you have hyperphantasia, I would think. Oh, yes. So I ask people with hyperphantasia, how often do you daydream? They say quite a bit. I've been told you can tell from my eyes when I'm not really there. I tend to always daydream. My mind will just go off. I daydream very often, too often, when I should be focusing on other things. I daydream all the time. I daydream every day. I have a problem with daydreaming too much. I can get lost. I'm very rarely bored. I daydream quite a lot. I sometimes don't go outside or interact with people because I'm happy to just daydream. So lots of daydreams with people with hyperphantasia. Never bored. So yeah, so there's that profile, hyperphantasia. So now, the first thing that I'm going to investigate with the objective tests is this idea that people with hyperphantasia have very realistic imagery. So if people with hyperphantasia have such realistic and vivid imagery, will they be more likely to confuse imagination with reality due to translating information into a visual format automatically? Or will their memory be more accurate than other people? The interviews were rather inconclusive in terms of how hyperfans perceive their memory. For some people, imagery seems beneficial to memory, and for others, it doesn't seem very beneficial. So you can see from these other interview statements, some people say I can picture memories well. I think my imagery helps with memory. Sometimes, someone else said, sometimes I confuse something I imagined with a real memory. So it's hard to tell whether hyperphantasia helps with memory or not. So I designed a test to find out whether people with hyperphantasia have better long-term memory for words and pictures. So this was a 2-part test that consisted of an encoding phase and a recall phase after 24 hours. So in this encoding phase, people were asked to look at a sequential series of words and pictures of concrete objects. If it was a word, people were asked to try and imagine it as vividly as they could in their mind's eye. And then after each word or picture, they were asked to rate the vividness of the image, either their mental image or the actual image. And they rated this on a scale from 1 to 5. And that's been done in previous studies. Participants knew that they would be tested on their memory for these items later, but they didn't know in what way. So actually, for half the items, words turned into pictures. And for another half of items, pictures turned into words. That is half of items, words turned into pictures, pictures turned into words. Another half of items, they stayed the same. So in the recall phase, participants again saw a sequential series of words and pictures, and they now had to indicate whether it was in the same format. So was the picture of a bacon that they see in the recall phase the same picture that they saw in the encoding phase? Or they had to indicate whether it had changed. So in this example, they now see a picture of a cat, when in the encoding phase, they saw the word cat. And that would be a change. So they just had to indicate in the recall phase, is this the same thing that you saw before, or did it change format? Word turned into picture, or picture turned into word. All right. So in the same condition, items from the encoding phase were presented in the same format in the recall phase. So if someone saw the picture of the cat in the encoding phase, they saw a picture of the cat in the recall phase. in this same condition. And if they saw the word cat in the encoding phase, they would see the word cat in the recall phase in this same condition. If it changed, however, if there was a picture to word change, that means that if they saw an image in the encoding phase, then they would see a word in the recall phase. And then a word to picture change was if they saw a word in the encoding phase, then they now saw an image in the recall phase, and they had to indicate that the item had changed. So the first thing I'm going to show you is this correlation between Vviq score, that's this vividness of visual imagery score, and vividness ratings for words and pictures in the encoding phase. So this was interesting for me because some previous research suggests that people with different mental imagery vividness will actually perceive pictures with different vividness as well. However, what you can see here, just before I even explain this graph to you, there doesn't seem to be any sort of relationship between these different scores. Each dot on this graph corresponds to a single participant, and the different colors indicate the different groups that they belong to. So someone with aphantasia is in blue, hypophantasia, low imagery is in green, typical imagery is in purple, and hyperphantasia is in orange. The first plot here shows how each person rated their picture vividness on a scale from 1 to 5. And that's on this tall axis here. And then their imagery vividness scores, the Vviq scores on this long axis here. And what you can see is basically just a jumble of ratings from 2 to 5. So nobody rated picture vividness under a 2, although you can see that the only 2s were rated by people with aphantasia. People with hyperphantasia are the only ones who started the picture vividness ratings at a rating of 3, 3 being more vivid than 2, 5 being the most vivid. However, even though there were these very small differences between groups, there was actually no significant group differences between any of the groups. So I did a series of tests between aphant and hyper, hypo and hyper, imager and aphant, et cetera, no differences between any of the groups on their picture vividness ratings. However, if you look at the word vividness ratings, so when they were asked to imagine the word that they were shown in the encoding phase, they had to imagine how vivid it was. Then they assigned it a vividness score from 1 to 5, and that is shown here, 1 to 5. Then you see a very clear correlation between Vviq score and word vividness rating, which suggests that people were actually trying to imagine the item that the word corresponded to. And if you are into statistics, this little BF box here just shows that this correlation is 100 times more likely than a null effect. So it's more likely to be true than false. In other words, it is extremely unlikely to get a correlation like this by chance. So onto the accuracy scores for words and pictures. The colored dots, again, correspond to individual participant scores, with blue corresponding to aphants, etc. The bars represent the area that likely contains the average accuracy score for each group. So here you have accuracies from 0 to 100% on this tall axis here. And so, for example, aphants are likely to have around 70 to 80% accuracy for this condition here. And I have 2 conditions next to each other. First of all, I first took 2 scores for each group, whether they were correct in remembering that a word stayed the same or correct in remembering that a picture stayed the same. And that's what these 2 bars next to each other represent for each group. And as you can see, they're pretty similar to each other. There seems to be a little bit of variation between groups. However, again, I did these group differences, these group tests, and again, there's no actual differences between groups in terms of whether people remembered that a word stayed the same or a picture stayed the same. Again, there actually is a small difference. If you look here at this dot at the very bottom, someone with hyperphantasia actually scored about 0% in one of the conditions. That probably indicates that they didn't understand the test. When I remove that dot, the results get even more similar. So like it's pretty non-compelling, the differences between the groups. Here's the next two accuracy conditions: when words turned into pictures and when pictures turned into words. Something that's really interesting to me is that when a picture turned into a word, that is when they saw a picture in the encoding phase, but a word in the recall phase, everyone was a lot worse. And I really don't know why. I don't know if anybody has any ideas about that. When a word turned into a picture, everyone was pretty high accuracy. But there were a lot of low scores across every group, though, when a picture turned into a word, which is really interesting because even people with hyperphantasia had this problem. People who seem to have a very strong visual imagery, who you might think would have a very accurate visual memory, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Everyone seems to have a very similar issue with remembering whether a word had been a picture. So again, no group differences in terms of long-term memory accuracy here. What do we got? Low effort, need to try harder to encode in word condition, not in the picture condition. That is very possible. Yeah, I was actually thinking that it's possible that the reason that the groups perform worse in the pick to word condition, it could be for different reasons, completely different reasons. So it's possible that people with hyperphantasia are showing low effort because it's easy for them to remember pictures, but then it's harder for them to remember the precision of it because they put low effort into it. And then someone with aphantasia might just not remember the picture format, obviously, because they don't have the imagery. So they're both performing more poorly, but perhaps for different reasons. We have to look into that further. Then what I did was I just put all of the 4 conditions together. So whether the word stayed the same, the picture stayed the same, word turned into a picture, picture turned into a word. I put all 4 conditions together and then just looked at the general difference across groups. And now what you can see is that there is a very small trend that people with hyperphantasia perform just a little bit better. However, under statistical scrutiny, there is still no group difference between any of the groups. Yeah, there's a trend, but it's not significant. It's not compelling whatsoever. So what this seems to suggest that is that within each group, there were those who found the task really difficult. There were those who found the task really easy, but memory for words and pictures does not seem to be related to visual imagery ability. So although people with hyperphantasia report realistic imagery, this does not seem to benefit long-term memory. So next we conducted a test to find out if it might help with short-term memory precision. So let me introduce that task. In this task, participants were shown a circle with lines going through it. This is called a grating. It was at a certain orientation on a 360-degree circle. So if you imagine that completely vertical lines is 360 or 0 degrees, this is a 335-degree orientation of these lines here. This is a classic kind of stimulus in short-term memory experiments, especially visual working memory experiments. Typically, people think that it requires very vivid imagery in order to hold this grating in mind. But as you will see, I'm going to spoil it for you. You don't need imagery to remember this orientation. So participants had to hold the orientation of this grating in mind, and they were tested after 4 seconds with a very difficult test. So they had to say whether there was an orientation change in a clockwise or counterclockwise or anti-clockwise direction. So here is an example of an easy change. Easy. So in the easy condition, the orientation changed by 10 degrees. So this is an example of a counterclockwise change. I'll go back to the cue again. You can see This is 335 degrees. This is 325 degrees. Very small shift counterclockwise. That's the easiest condition. Here's the cue again. In the medium condition, it changed by 6 degrees of orientation. So here, for example, is a 328 degree orientation. Again, the cue, 335 degrees, 328 degrees. If you see them right after each other, if I sort of flip the screen back and forth pretty quick, you can see the change usually. Some people might not be able to see the change still, but maybe you can see the change. But what made it really difficult is that there was 4 seconds in between the two for comparison. So you had to hold that in mind. And then the really difficult test, there was still an even more difficult condition in which there was a 3-degree change. So in this case, this is 332 degrees of orientation compared to 335 degrees. And you might be able to see a change if you see them right after each other. Yes, so following the cue, and this could appear at any orientation except for a cardinal direction. So we made sure that we didn't have any completely vertical, completely horizontal, or 45-degree angles, because we didn't want people to just verbalize what the cue was, and it's really easy to imagine a vertical grading. So we made this task really as hard as possible. It could be any orientation that was not a cardinal orientation. Following the cue, there was this brief image called a noise image that was just meant to get rid of the after image of the cue, because usually if you just show this on a screen, on a black screen, and then take it away real quick, you can see a very distinct after image. And we thought, oh, this will probably make the task so easy. Everyone will get 100% because they'll be looking at the after image. So we created this a noise image to present after the cue to make it even harder. Then there was a blank screen for 4 seconds, a blank black screen, during which participants were supposed to keep the cue orientation in mind. And then they were presented with the test grading, and they had to indicate whether there was a clockwise or counterclockwise change in orientation. There was always a change, but participants didn't know ahead of time whether it would be easy, medium, or hard. And can you see this GIF? You might be able to see this. This is just an example of what it looked like. There's the noise image, now just a blank screen. And then you have the test image, and you had to indicate whether there was a clockwise or counterclockwise change. In early versions of this task, so the GIF version of this task, during piloting, we gave people 2 seconds to respond. That turned out to be extremely difficult. In the version that I'm going to show you the results for, people had as long as they needed to respond. And also what we did in the real task was we had people indicate how confident they were in their response. So after every grading, after they made their response, clockwise or counterclockwise, they then indicated their confidence in their response on a 1 to 6 scale. And that's really the only difference from this sequence. So the important thing is that we wanted to know the strategies that people use to perform this task. So after they performed the whole task, they were taken to a questionnaire to describe their short-term memory strategies. So what were they thinking of during this blank screen in order to make their response? So the hypothesis was that people with imagery would try to use a precise visual strategy to remember the orientation. But what about people with hyperphantasia or aphantasia? So the strategies I'm going to describe upcoming are based on extensive piloting. And yeah, I hate to admit how long this took. I had been tinkering with this task for about 2 years before I got to the final stage that you see here. And we came up with 5 main strategies that people tend to use. And the visual strategy is the first one that I'm showing you here. People could use a verbal strategy. That is, they would try to estimate the degree of orientation and then rehearse the number in their head over the delay period, and then try and estimate the number again for the test. That would be a pretty inefficient strategy, but we had thought that people with aphantasia would actually use a verbal strategy. I don't know why we thought that, but you know, you just have to test it. People could use a semantic strategy. So they could imagine something meaningful like the hands of a clock to better remember the orientation. We had heard that this was a popular strategy that people could use. They could use a spatial strategy. So for example, focusing on a point in space where a line ended, and then comparing that point to the shifted point in the test image. Or they could use a sensory motor strategy. So they might imagine tracing their finger along the line or moving their eyes back and forth along the remembered orientation. So the first thing we did was to determine the strategies that people used from the different groups. So here you have aphantasia, hypophantasia, imagery, typical imagery, that is, and hyperphantasia. And then on this tall axis here, we added up how often people said they did not use the strategy, whether that strategy was secondary to another strategy, whether they used it combined pretty equally with another strategy, whether it was their dominant strategy or their only strategy. And so we have that on this axis here. And what you can see pretty distinctly is a difference in the visual strategies that people use. And this was something that, this was actually the only thing that we hypothesized very clearly, was that obviously people with aphantasia and hypophantasia would be less likely to use a visual strategy than people with imagery or hyperphantasia. But what we didn't realize was that the spatial strategy would be so dominant for all of these categories. So this is the visual strategy here, where you have this very precise visual grading, and then the spatial strategy where people remembered a point on a line, for example. And this was a pretty dominant strategy across the 4 categories. And now I'm going to show you the sensory motor strategies. Interestingly, all 4 groups reported the use of sensory motor strategies, usually in combination with other strategies. Interesting. All right. Also interesting and contradicting common belief, verbal strategies were not very popular among any of the groups, and semantic strategies were also not very popular. So that was particularly surprising for us because we thought that people with aphantasia might be likely to use a verbal strategy, if nothing else. But in fact, it was still quite secondary to everything else. And here are all the different strategies together. The biggest differences across the 4 groups was the use of a visual strategy. And statistically, when I did the statistics on the difference between these strategy reports, the only difference that came out was the visual strategy. Every other strategy was used similarly by all 4 groups. So basically, in sum, among people with aphantasia and hypophantasia, the winning strategies are spatial and sensory motor, whereas among people with imagery and hyperphantasia, the winning strategies are visual, spatial, and sensory motor. So next I performed this series of tests to find out statistically which of the groups were different from each other for the different strategies. And we did comparisons of every group. Again, these BF boxes indicate how likely the effect is to be true. So 100 times more likely, 50 times more likely, 10 times or 3 times more likely. 3 times is pretty moderate evidence for a difference. 10 times or more is considered strong evidence, very strong, extremely strong evidence. And here is just the statistics, what I just mentioned to you from the figure, that in fact, the biggest difference was in the visual strategy use. And if you break it down by group, the biggest difference, the strongest difference that you find in terms of visual strategy use is between hypers and aphants. So people with complete aphantasia and the highest, most extreme vivid imagery. And then you get moderate evidence for a difference between typical imagers and hypos. Hypers and hypos, typicals and aphants, and then typicals and hypos. And there was no difference in visual strategy use between hypers and imagers. So they they tended to use visual strategies quite dominantly, whereas both aphants and hypos did not use visual strategies. That's all that this shows. We also looked at accuracy across easy, medium, and hard trials for the 4 groups. Again, the groups are color-coded with aphants shown in blue, hypos shown in green, imagers shown in purple, hypers shown in orange. And likely average accuracies are shown as those bars again. Individual participant scores are shown as those dots. There is a general effect of task difficulty from easy, medium, and hard. So easy, condition, medium, and hard here. And here's accuracy from about 40% accurate all the way up to 100% accurate. So generally people get worse as the task gets harder, which is expected. However, there are no group differences between any groups. In terms of confidence ratings, so now what I have on this tall axis here is people's confidence in their responses from 1 to 6, easy, medium, and hard conditions. And what you can see is that actually people with hyperphantasia tend to be more confident. Got it. They tend to be more confident in their responses. But that doesn't contribute to the accuracy in their responses. So in terms of this realistic imagery thing, it seems that if you have realistic imagery, typical imagery that's not very realistic, or no imagery at all, it doesn't seem to benefit or reduce long-term memory or short-term memory. So the next thing we wanted to do was dive deeper into this ability that many hypers have, which is the ability to project their imagery into the external world. Oh, did people know which category they were in before this test? Yes, we categorized them from the interviews. Indeed, we did. However, the thing was, we told them what we thought of their imagery, whether we thought they belonged to a certain category. But we did say, if you think you belong to a different category, of course, indicate that. But everybody agreed with the category that we came to. But yes, people were aware of which category they were in before the test. So now I'm going to talk about this thing called Profantasia. This next test by my citizen science collaborator, Alec Figueroa. It was made to rate people's imagery ability or people's ability to mentally project, which is Profantasia, according to him. Right, so this is the Profantasia test with your eyes. With your eyes open, imagine a red 5-point star and attempt to see the star out in front of you in the black space below. So people would just try to project a red 5-pointed star as vividly as they could. And then they were meant to compare their projected imagery to the chart here. So 1 means no projection ability whatsoever. 2 means that they're able to project a faint outline of a star. 3 means that they can project a clear outline of the star. 4, that they can project a filled star, but it has no color. 5, it's kind of a faint red star. And then 6 is a clear filled red star. So they just had to rate their ability to project their imagery. It's all right, it happens. I thought my internet was going to go out. Nope. That didn't happen. Not yet. All right. So people could choose only one image that best fit with their experience. And we tallied up the number of people who reported each one. So we asked people, how well were you able to project the red star into the black space? Remember, this should not be like imagining a red star, but physically seeing a star, 1 through 6. Then we split the tallies into hypers, imagers, hypos, and complete aphants. And then I color-coded the frequencies of each experience so that it's easier to see the difference between groups. Red means that nobody or almost nobody reported this experience. Green means that everybody or almost everybody from the group reported this experience. And then yellow means somewhere in the middle. Some people reported the experience and some did not. So the first thing I did was to compare just complete zero Profantasia, no Profantasia ability whatsoever, to maximally clear Profantasia. And for aphantasia and hyperphantasia, you can see that nearly everybody reported zero Profantasia ability, zero projection ability, and nobody reported maximal projection from these groups. However, with typical imagery added, you can see that it's closer to 50-50, with slightly more people saying that they can't project their imagery. And then with hypers, more reported maximal Profantasia than no Profantasia. And then looking at the full scale of projection ability, you can see that a few individuals from both aphants and hypo categories reported being able to see a very faint outline of a star in the black space, but never a clear outline or a filled star. Whereas people with typical imagery show a more diverse distribution of responses, they were pretty much equally likely to see various stars. And if someone with hyperphantasia was able to project their imagery, it was always a filled star, more likely to have some color, and most likely to be a bright red star. And if you're into statistics, I did perform also a Bayesian test on these data, and the groups did differ from each other based on these groups. But which groups are more different and which groups are more similar? So to find this out, I again performed the series of comparisons that I've shown you before. And I wanted to find out the strength of their differences using these BF tests, these Bayesian tests, to denote how likely effects were to be true. And basically, the biggest difference, again, that I see in projection ability is between hypers and total aphants, which showed strong evidence for a difference, whereas there was moderate evidence for a difference between hypers and hypos, typical imagers and complete aphants, and then typical imagers and hypos. And no difference between hypers and imagers, and no difference between hypos and aphants. And then here's another visualization of that data. As before, the dots are color-coded by their imagery category, and Profantasia readings are displayed on the tall axis. I made a dashed line to show that no filled stars were reported by people with aphantasia or hypophantasia, and a clear outline is only visible by people with typical imagery. And then hypers were most likely to see clearly colored stars out in front of them, if they saw anything at all. So to conclude on that part, the report that hypers are likely to have Profantasia is supported by a separate test, although I should point out that this is still completely subjective, and this does need to be substantiated with more objective measures, such as measuring eye tracking of projected images. The next report that I want to follow up on is the idea that hypers have very strong emotional imagery. So while that seems to be true, it is important to look at the full spectrum of imagery abilities to understand more about emotional imagery. As I mentioned previously, people with aphantasia and hypophantasia do report having emotional imagery. So it's not so clear-cut whether there is a difference across groups. So to investigate this, I had participants fill out the SciQ, which is the Plymouth Sensory Imagery Questionnaire, which asks participants to rate various types of sensory and body imagery, as well as emotional imagery. And basically what I did was I added up their responses on emotional imagery questions. So they were asked, imagine feeling excited on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being just the concept, 10 being I'm actually excited. They also had to imagine feeling relieved and imagine feeling scared on a 0 to 10 scale. So I just summed that up, divided by 3, and took the average emotional imagery score with a maximum of 10. And here you have average emotional imagery on the tall axis, again, 0 to 10 score. And then you have your aphants in blue, hypos in green, etc. Each bar represents that likely average emotional imagery score for each group. And it looks like a general increase across groups. Notably, out of 18 aphants that were tested on this questionnaire, none of them rated the maximum of 10 for all 3 questions. They were the only group that didn't have any 10 ratings. But as you can see, there's still a lot of overlap between the groups. And so I did the series of group comparisons again to see if there are any differences between groups in terms of emotional imagery. And the only difference I found was that hypers are more than 3 times as likely to be different from aphants. Just moderate evidence that they're different from each other, and no other group showed differences from each other. Finally, I did a correlation analysis between emotional imagery ratings and Vviq score. So again, you have your Vviq score, general imagery vividness score on the bottom axis here, and then emotional imagery on this tall axis, color-coded as before. And it seems like a correlation analysis best captures this relationship between emotional imagery and visual imagery. That is, as Vviq scores increase, emotional imagery also increases. But it's not a big jump between groups, because you can see there's still a lot of variability between groups. So it does seem that emotions are tied to visual imagery vividness, but imagery is not necessary for high emotional imagery. And this will also be important to follow up in the future. Any correlations to synesthesia? Very interesting. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, because there is some research to show that people with aphantasia can also have synesthesia. So I don't know the relationship there yet. It's really interesting. I think that there's usually a correlation, but I don't think it's linear and it's not so clear cut. All right. So the final point I want to expand on is the report that hyperphantasics, can easily imagine unreal things or fantastic things. So the way I measured this was to use a design I call Ganz flicker, which is a full screen red and black flicker at 7.5 Hertz frequency. A couple of years ago, I was searching for ways to induce visual illusions in different people. I was trying to find a reliable way. My first investigation was on something called pareidolia, where basically I was looking at the effect where people see animals in clouds, Jesus in toast, that kind of thing. But the effects were not very consistent. And once people caught on, there was no real object embedded in the noise. People stopped looking for stuff and they stopped seeing things. So I moved on to visual flicker. And visual flicker is known to cause people to see some very surprising things, but I didn't know how effective this would be. Pretty much immediately, my research assistant at the time started listing all the things that he could see in the Ganz flicker, and it was really apparent that this was working, that something was happening, that people could see something just in this flickering red and black. So I jumped on this opportunity to investigate Ganz flicker experiences in people with different visual imagery abilities. Ganz flicker, I call it Ganz flicker. The subtitles don't understand, but that's almost it. Ganz flicker. Right, so I asked people to report what they saw in the Ganz flicker. After watching for about 10 minutes, some people saw simple pseudo hallucinations, and I categorized simple as illusory colors or geometric patterns. So for example, some people saw shapes, oscillating geocentric patterns, blue and yellow lightning bolts zigzagging across the screen. That's mostly what people saw. However, others saw complex real-world objects and even entire environments. So I was getting a lot of variation in people's responses, and I wanted to know if this was tied to imagery ability somehow. And here you can see some people's responses went on for paragraphs and paragraphs, but this one says, I was outside of the room, the building was spinning. Later, I started seeing like the outside of a building. It was like a castle. There were some stone columns and it was all bluish stone. Someone was standing looking at me, but it was just a shadow. Then I was flying above it. So the person was small and then I couldn't see anything. So like entire scenes would play out for some people. So what I found, first of all, let me take a look. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I don't see anything complex in Ganz flicker. I'm still really surprised when I get these reports from people that they see these like really complex things. And that's definitely also something that needs to be followed up on. So what I did was I did these group comparisons again to find out if people's complexity responses were different between the different groups. So hypers versus complete aphants. And I just did a very basic binarized comparison. Did people see complex things in the Gunsplicka, or did they see simple things in the Gunsplicka? And people with hyperphantasia are 50 times more likely to see complex things compared to simple things, compared to people with aphantasia, who are much more likely to see simple things. So these groups are very strongly different from each other. Whereas people with hyperphantasia versus hypophantasia show a moderate difference in complexity. Whereas in terms of all the other groups, there are no compelling differences between the groups in terms of Gunsplicka complexity. So again, you're seeing this really big difference between the most extreme two groups, not usually typical imagers versus complete aphants, or even hypos, or any of the other groups. So I thought perhaps the relationship could be better expressed as a correlation. And so that is what I'm showing you here. We have the correlation matrix of complexity ratings from formless colors to geometric patterns. And then people could report both. They could report complex objects, complex environments, or both complex objects and environments. And here I have this black dashed line to indicate the boundary between simple and complex reports. And what you see, and again, the groups are color coded. Blue is complete aphants, orange is hyperphants. And you can see that there is a correlation from aphants to hyperphants in terms of Gunsplicka complexity. People with aphantasia are very likely to see simple pseudohallucinations, whereas people with hypophantasia actually can see complex objects. 2 of them reported seeing complex objects, whereas in terms of seeing whole complex environments or both complex environments and objects, only people with typical imagery or hyperphantasia saw both of those things. So basically hypers, if you look at this distribution here, there were still a lot of them that saw simple pseudo hallucinations in the Gunsplicka, but most of them did actually see complex information, whereas aphants and hypos generally saw simple pseudo hallucinations. So hypers are the most likely to see complex pseudo hallucinations, which corresponds to their report in the interviews that they can easily imagine unreal things. Nevertheless, I do have some future studies planned to investigate this further as well, using more objective measures. So in conclusion, objective short-term and long-term memory tests suggest no benefit or detriment to performance based on visual imagery ability. The biggest differences that we find are subjective. So in terms of memory precision strategies, people with aphantasia and hypophantasia are more likely to report completely spatial or sensory motor strategies, whereas people with imagery or hyperphantasia report visual spatial strategies. In terms of projection ability or profantasia, aphants and hypos are not likely to have any profantasia, whereas some people with typical imagery report profantasia, but it's not usually very strong. And the most realistic projection ability is reported by hypers. And then in terms of emotional imagery, it does seem that hypers have the strongest emotional imagery, but this does need to be tested more thoroughly. And then in terms of pseudo-hallucination complexity, hypers are the most likely to see complex pseudo-hallucinations as well. So are these categories of visual imagery ability meaningful? Does it make sense to separate people into dichotomous imagery versus aphantasia categories, or does it make sense to distinguish more categories of imagery ability? What it seems to suggest, I'm not going to go into this whole huge table, but basically I just put all of those BFs from the previous talk the last nearly hour and a half. Wow, I went way over time. I summarize it all in this table here. And basically what you find is that people with, if you look at just hypers versus complete aphants, they show the strongest differences on everything. They seem to be the ones who are driving any effects. If people are looking at imagers versus aphants, no matter how you combine the distributions, if you happen to report people, if you happen to recruit people with hyperphantasia and complete aphantasia, they will probably be skewing your data. So yes, are these categories meaningful? I think when people are actually reporting imagery versus aphantasia, it mainly reflects a difference between hyperphantasia and aphantasia. And I do think we need to spend a lot more time learning about this hyperphantasia category. And now we know that this group differs from the others and shows the biggest differences from aphantasia. So finally, that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I would finally like to thank my collaborators on this project, Alec and Wes. So Wes is currently an undergraduate at Edge Hill University. He's my research intern, and he collected about half of the interviews that I talked about today. And if you would like to learn more about me and my work, you can follow me on Twitter, check out my Google Scholar, or go to my website, ReshanneReeder.com. So thank you very much.